Welcome back. This is Daybreak, and thank you for staying with us. On my far right is Dr. Stephen Jackson, the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Kenya. Good morning.
Good morning to you, Ike.
Lovely having you here, Doctor.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Ahmed Idris, on my immediate right, is the Secretary General of the Kenya Red Cross. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to have you here, Dr. And Dr. Isaac Kalua Green is an ecopreneur. Good morning, Dr.
Good morning, and thank
Lovely
you
having you here.
Thank you.
Well, let's begin with the meeting on Monday, where the government launched a disaster fund to help mitigate the impact of the flooding situation across the country. The Deputy President, Rigathi Gachagua, said the fund will help the national and the county governments to address the urgent needs of more than 300,000 displaced persons across the country. His announcement came as development partners who were in the meeting started donating towards the floods disaster fund, and the president pledged that the relocated people from riparian lands will not be resettled, as the government seeks to resettle them through the affordable housing project that his administration is undertaking. Brenda Wanga sets up our discussion with the following report.
The devastation caused by the heavy rains and flooding across most parts of the country have led the national government to seek help both locally and internationally to help those whose lives have been upended by this disaster.
Even with extensive government-led programs at both national and county level, we appreciate the need to receive and coordinate additional support for greater effectiveness. In this regard, we are calling on our development partners, the private sector, non-state actors, and individual well-wishers to contribute in cash and in kind.
The activation of the disaster fund will provide a structured manner in which Kenya and her development partners and friends can lend a hand in her time of need, brought about by acts of nature. Already, development partners have begun responding to this call of action.
So, and actually I'm happy to say that even today that number on this slide has grown a little bit more. We've been able to mobilize about $7 million US. That's about 900 million shillings, I think, in today's money.
Development partners have been asked to channel their cash donations through the National Treasury, while the private sectors and Kenyans willing to donate will do so through the National Disaster Emergency Response Appeal Fund. Other in-kind donations are to be delivered to the National Disaster Operations Center at Nyayo House. The KDF, NYS and Red Cross will warehouse the donations for distribution to the affected people.
I wish to call upon...
The national government, on the other hand, says it had already allocated some 3.5 billion shillings in the budget for emergencies, with the arid and semi-arid areas getting the lion's share of this amount of 2 billion shillings, while the Ministry of Roads got $500 million shillings and the Interior Ministry was allocated 300 million shillings. This amount is insufficient, hence the need for more help. But beyond the call for fundraising to mitigate the disaster, the government maintains the need to be more proactive in future by mapping the areas likely to be impacted by such disasters and preparing adequately.
So I'm very grateful. The culture of taking security alerts, weather alerts, public safety alerts seriously is very important. We are just left with just within the estates and the villages where people are still crossing rivers when they should not be doing so. And again, that is sensitization that we continue.
When the government seeks for that additional support, the president, who paid a visit to one of the urban theatres of the floods in Mathare, was categorical that there will be no resettlement on the riparian land that is now being reclaimed. President Ruto insisting that the government will take care of the housing needs of over 40,000 people evacuated from such homes.
Wale wote households 40,000 hapa Nairobi ambayo wamehamishwa kwa sababu ya safety yao. Kila boma serikali tutawapatia shilingi 10,000 ya kutafuta makao mahali mtakaa mkingojea mpango ya serikali.
Ruto says the process of rehousing the affected begins this week for the construction of 20,000 affordable housing units. He says these houses will be allocated to those moved from the riparian areas as a first priority. Brenda Wanga, Citizen TV.
First to you, Dr. Stephen Jackson, and you have said what's required is, as of now, $7 million US, about 900 million Kenya shillings. But it seems that with the unrelenting heavy rains across the country, that is, with it washing away farmland, poses even more risks and the need for more money. How are these resources going to be coming about?
So, once again, thank you very much for having me on, Ayob. And before I answer that, can I just reiterate our condolences from the United Nations? Our Secretary General already last week sent his deepest sympathies to those who've lost their lives, those who've lost their livelihoods, and already the number of those affected in those ways has risen again. So let me just, on behalf of the UN, really send our deepest sympathies and say that we are in solidarity with Kenya and Kenyans. So the amount of money that I was able to announce when we were together with His Excellency the DP the other day is, I hope, just the beginning. It's not what we need, it's what we have. About $7 million US, about 900 million shillings. We reckon, on the basis of a planning exercise that we did with Red Cross and the many other partners, both national and international, earlier this year, we reckon we need about another 2.5 times that amount, another 19 million US dollars, to meet what we think is going to be the scale of the crisis, just in terms of the emergency needs. And then, of course, later in the conversation, I'm sure that we will also talk about what we're going to need in terms of reconstruction. Okay.
Dr. Ahmed is coming to you. You have been across the country. Yesterday, you were in Kisumu County, one of the counties that have been severely affected across the country. And if you were to give a snapshot of what's happening across the country, we were in Tana River as well with the officials over the weekend. And it seems that the heavy rains, the impact is more or less blowing out. And in terms of your assistance then, is it outpacing what you're rolling out in terms of food and non-food items and in terms of personnel? Is there a stretch on your part?
Yeah, so one of my key response, colleagues who are planning this response yesterday indicated, and he compared the needs at the ground level and what we are getting, or the resources we have, similar to the amount of rain that is falling and the ability of the ground to absorb the water. So he said the reason why we have flooding is there is more rain than the ground can absorb. And the emergency situation, we have more needs than the resources that we're getting. So at the end of the day, we're anticipating that when we reach the peak of humanitarian operations, as an organization, even before we factor in all the other humanitarian agencies, we'll be needing about 2.8 billion shillings for that operation. Yeah. Our estimate, when we add recovery for the, to support the farmers and the affected communities, we're looking at about 7 billion. So the summary is the situation on the ground is really dire from a humanitarian perspective. The needs are growing, and the reason why we have this concerted effort to coordinate all the agencies towards one united front of directing all resources in a coordinated manner is that, so that at least we have equitable distribution of resources, and there are no communities that we haven't addressed their needs.
Yeah, all right, and different, of course, parts of the country are facing different problems. For example, the case of Tana River County, it hasn't rained there, but because of the downstream effect of the flooding by the Tana River, families are being forced out of their homelands. Therefore, how do you treat different situations differently?
So geographically, first, as a country, the humanitarian situation is a complex one. There are situations where there are multiple risk factors that are existing side by side, not just the flood. We have a caseload, as I said last evening here, of persons who are in need of food assistance from the last drought, and estimated about 1.5 million people who are still in need of food assistance across the country. There are places where people are displaced as a result of insecurity, including Baringo. We have outbreak of diseases that are opportunistic in the sense of the waterborne diseases that follow periods of flood, such as the one we're experiencing now. We have 35 cases of cholera that has been confirmed in Tana River. So nationally speaking, there's a complex humanitarian situation and a complex humanitarian operation to respond to those needs. But geographically, yes, we have to break down every area depending on the needs. The needs in Tana River are not the same as in Nyando, where I was yesterday. The needs in Homa Bay are not the same as the needs in Baringo, where I'll be today immediately after this discussion. So we have to plan for every region according to the specific needs, the humanitarian needs and the operational needs of that area, which creates a complexity across the country. I'll give you one other example. Nairobi is now registering one of the largest displacements that we've witnessed in a flooding period. This is new for many humanitarian organizations. Humanitarian response in an urban area is a complex one, extremely complex, and we have to all adapt towards delivering assistance even in the midst of that complexity. So the toll it has on the humanitarian organizations, on the government that is providing leadership for this response is big, it's major. It is not an easy response, but it is one that we are trying our best to, present a coordinated approach together with UN colleagues under the combined leadership of the national and county governments. Yeah, okay.
Dr. Kalua, again, coming to you. Later in the course of this broadcast, we'll talk also about the climate aspect. And of course, there were conversations around climate change. We had the Devolution Conference 2021 in Makueni County, which was themed multi-level governance for climate action, bringing that nearer in close proximity to the Mwananchi down there. But then the vicious mix of this natural disaster and a lack of planning, which is having a bearing on the public. Would it have been an improved situation had we planned better with regards to taking into account the predictions that were given and the advices by the Met Department, and also the realization that we were living, or the world at the moment is experiencing climate change? And had we planned better, would the situation have been different?
Thank you for having me. I pray that God Almighty comforts the families of those who have lost their dear ones and those who are looking for homes displaced. My condolences and prayers that they may be well. I also want to congratulate my brother, the Red Cross and the team of emergency responding agents and people who are doing great in the country and the UN. Thank you for what you're doing. It's a situation that, as it is a calamity. It is a disaster. Disaster, you can never plan for disaster at any given time. There may be situations that you can be able to change. There may be situations that you may be able to handle differently. However, it is the way that they happen in the flash manner that they have, it becomes a problem that you cannot plan fully for. However, there are opportunities that we need to look at. How did we get where we are today? If the person who is running factories and has been transporting timber and that has been transporting firewood for firing equipment, big factories, a lot of trucks that you see every day, if that was handled differently, we would be talking of a different situation. If the lowest person today who is selling the carpet grass in the streets, if they did not go to uproot grass in the forests or get trucks of vehicles going into the forest and preserve that, we would not be having some of the situations and houses being cleared the way they have been cleared at the moment. If you go to some of those, it's just because we disturbed the place. We did not honor what is expected. Law was not followed in the way that it was supposed to be. If it is building along the riverines and the riparian space, if we avoided that, it would have been different. However, how then do you handle this kind of a situation? People and human beings do handle their situations differently. You move to stay where there is an opportunity of development. Okay. I'll give you an example as I finish to respond on you. My father moved our grandmother out of a place that was not fully developed, so that because she was asthmatic, that she moves in a place where there is medication and closer to hospital. Everybody is doing that to move to where development is. As a result, we have 80% of Kenyans living in 20% of the land area in Kenya. If we foresaw this and started working on developing other areas so that our distribution of where the population is, things may have.
So that is the question of population density.
Yes.
Can that be then solved because we have the devolved system of governance, we have resources going to the counties, we have also devolved some powers from the center as a result of our current dispensation, the constitutional order. Is then the solution more awareness on urban-rural migration and the development therein? And also you talked about the question of timber. Is awareness needed around planting more trees and the need for improving our forest cover to forestall such a catastrophe that we are witnessing?
It needs a higher thinking, very critically, because when we talk about where people are living in Kenya, how is Kenya distributed? And if you go back to a document called Sessional Paper number 8 of 2012 about improving our arid and semi-arid regions, you will realize that our country is about 87% is the arid and semi-arid region of our country. And that is the arid and semi-arid regions. How much land is that? It's about 400 square kilometers. How many roads do we have? You find that by 2011, 2012, we only had 1,000 kilometers of the road that is tarmacked in that region. You do not expect people to move and stay in a place where there is no development, minimum being the road network in that specific place. There has been improvement from governments. And why people want to come, the people who live in and around the water towers, they are looking for water. The people who live in Isli, in their big numbers, and I respect them, is because there is nothing much that can be done in northern Kenya. They are moving closer to where they can be able to get development and they can access development in these places. So we need to think wider. We need to ask ourselves, why are people living in these areas? What can be done so that we can distribute development in the best way possible, access to everything that human beings need, so that we can extend this.
All right. Dr. Stephen, coming to you, talking about that pool of resources needed by the multi-stakeholders, and here there are 34 confirmed cases of cholera in the county of Tana River. Farmlands are washed away. People are continuously being displaced. I mean, does this point to coalition of more resources? And do you think this may end up also stretching the multi-stakeholders, given the extent of the damage caused by the heavy rains?
I definitely do think it is a question of stretch. If we look globally, last year, the humanitarian ask at the international level was bigger than it's been in the history of ever. And that was as a result of the war in Ukraine, of course, the instability in the Middle East, and now the conflict. So we are at a stretch globally, which means that in a country like Kenya, international partners are often coming up with pockets that are close to empty. And yet we also know that the need is rising. One of the things that my brother just pointed to is the fact that we are getting disaster piled on top of disaster. So we were only just coming out of 3 years of drought in Kenya, the worst drought that we've known of since record keeping began. And then we whiplash straight into flooding. And let's not forget, this is the second season of flooding in a row. We actually had flooding October, November, December that in absolute terms was worse. We had nearly 600,000 people impacted. Nairobi wasn't hit, but Tana River, that we've mentioned already, was hit very hard. And so what's happening, Ayub, is that we're getting to a point where, first of all, the urgency of the moment is crowding out the ability to think long-term in the way that Dr. Kalua Green is pointing to. And we are not also able, so that's a time problem, but a resources problem as well. The money is getting crowded out. So the money goes into this urgency of immediate response, life-saving need, and prevents us from being able to invest in the kinds of long-term measures that would actually reduce the risk down the line. And that takes us straight to the climate emergency, which I know we're going to talk about, because one of the impacts of the climate emergency is to trap us in permanent disaster and never allow us to sort of get up to to look up from the business of that immediate response to thinking about how we reduce the risk long term.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we're stretched.
Okay, beyond the infrastructure that we'll talk about, Dr. Idris and Dr. Isaac, still on you, Dr. Stephen. I'm looking at the landmass of irrigation that were affected by the flooding. For example, more than 300 hectares by yesterday in a report that we had filed here in Baringo South, which was largely also benefiting locals in Baringo and Nakuru counties, was underwater. In Mwea, the county of Kirinyaga, 2,000 acreage of rice crop submerged by the floods across the country, and by extension, the infrastructure system in terms of the agriculture has also been destroyed. Is it not a worrying situation for you, the multi-stakeholders, the government, the state and non-state actors, all, that during the drought we're talking about food insecurity, and now there is a looming food security situation, which by extension speaks to both extremes, where people have no food in the end.
Correct.
I mean, how then are you going to be approaching this situation?
Yep, so you are pointing to a real note of alarm. The first priority has to be thinking about the now, right? It has to be thinking about people whose lives are immediately in peril, whose livelihoods are immediately threatened. But behind that, what you're pointing to is the enormous damage that these kinds of shocks from the climate are doing to Kenya's development pathway. So we already saw in the last couple of years food prices rising precipitously in Kenya because of factors beyond Kenya's control. The conflict in Ukraine, COVID, the lingering effects of that. But climate also, you can think of this as like this weight that the Kenyan car is sort of dragging behind it as it's trying to accelerate up that highway of development. There's this weight that is holding us back. And the climate emergency is that, and it's not an abstract thing. It's very concrete in terms of things like the impact on food production. I think we're going to see a further spike in food prices this year because of the damage to Kenya's production and because of the damage to the infrastructure. I was, even last year during the floods, when I went up to Garissa, and I saw that 1/2 of the highway between Garissa and Tana River had literally been washed away, a beautiful new tarmac highway. Half of it was gone. So the power of these floods, not just to really affect lives in the immediate, but to exert a real brake on Kenya's development trajectory, that's something that has us very worried. And as I said, right now, we have to be focused energy and money on the immediate response, but is there going to be energy and money for the recovery?
Thank you. When we get back from the break, Dr. Idris and Dr. Kalua Green, and he mentions the aspect of infrastructure, and we're talking about the climate question, whether our infrastructure can withstand the situations across the world at the moment. Kenya, of course, is no exception, just like many African countries bearing the brunt of the climate change, yet it's no contributor in terms of its gas emission to the pollution across the world and the need for the cutting off from the polluting countries, majorly in Europe, in the United States, and also in Asia. This is Daybreak. The hashtag on X is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. The discussion with the three doctors continues here on the broadcast after the break. Stay tuned.